All right, good morning. Well, it's great to be here this morning. I hope that as you sing that you are here and have reason to rejoice. Right? There's a lot of things in this season that we rejoice over, but we remind ourselves that our true reason for rejoicing is why we're gathered here together this morning, because of our God and what He has done for us as we celebrate this Christmas season of remembering Jesus and what He did for us. And so I hope that you are rejoicing this morning. My name is Reed. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm so glad that you joined us this morning. I'm going to go ahead and dismiss the kids. They can stand up. I know when I start talking too long before that, they always wonder if they're going to have to sit through my entire sermon. Well, it's great to be here this morning. I hope that you are off to a good morning. It was a little chilly out there this morning, right? Wake up, the frost is on the ground, and I'm loving it. I know that many of you don't, but I love it. And we can also be thankful because it's been kind of a not a very bad winter so far. I don't know if winter's actually started, but it's been okay so far. And I'm reminded of I've gotten to live in a number of different places. And how many of you have ever been in a really, really bad storm? Raise your hand. Right, most of us. And probably that would be on a scale. Some maybe in a really bad storm where they were fearing for their lives. Others, maybe it was just raining a little bit outside. But growing up, so I grew up in Denver and then through high school in northern Wisconsin. And so we would get really bad snowstorms, blizzards that you could hardly even see. Sometimes you couldn't open the door after the storm because the snow was piled up against the door. And then we got to live in Palau in the South Pacific for a while, and there you got to see some pretty powerful storms. And you just hope that you're not out on the water in a boat when those storms happen. I remember a few times that we had to go into a house, our neighbor's house, because it was a little more solid than ours and had, it was built out of completely concrete because the typhoons were coming through. And we had to take refuge for the night in these more fortified buildings. But in all of that, I have never really been in a place where I was afraid for my life, where I feared that I might not survive through the night in the storm. And we're going to take a look at a storm like that this morning as we look and continue our study in the book of Acts. But as we think about these storms and physical storms where the weather is on us and you feel so helpless and like you are at the mercy of the weather, of what's going on around you, the greatest storms, I think, that we face in life may not be the storms that we face outside, but storms that we face in our lives. Storms rarely come from the deck of a ship like we're going to see this morning, or huddled in a shelter like even we were there in Palau during the typhoons. For most of us, the greatest storms in our lives will come from things like losing a loved one, a strained or a broken relationship, financial hardship, or simply the accumulation of the countless stresses that life brings our way. And perhaps as you're sitting here this morning, you think, that resonates with me. I either am in the middle of a storm, or I'm just coming out of one, or I'm heading into a storm, a trial, and how life brings these our way. And so as Christians, I want us to understand as we look at the life of Paul and his journey to Rome, now I want us to see how do we face these difficulties and storms that life brings our way. See, through loss and failure and frustration and stress, we, as Christians, have hope. As children of God, we can stand firm in the midst of the storm, not in our own strength, but through the power of God within us. And so as we've been studying through Acts, we're getting near the end. We're going to get into chapter 28. It's the last chapter. All right, I'm glad I didn't hear any cheers, right? But we've made it through. Over a year we've been going through the book of Acts, and I hope that it's been an encouragement to you. But we're heading into the last chapter. We're going to take a short break for Christmas, and then on the last Sunday of the year, Stephen's going to finish chapter 28 as we bring the book of Acts to a close. But throughout this story of the birth and the life of the church, we have seen primarily through Paul's life, he's shown us through countless examples of perseverance through hardship. And again, in our passage today, we see the faithfulness of our God. And so I'm going to read. I'd love for you to follow along as I read out loud. You can follow along if you need a Bible. There should be one right under the seat in front of you. If you don't own a Bible, please take that. That's our gift to you. We'd love for you to have that. I'm going to begin in chapter 27, and we're going to read through part of chapter 28, verse 16. So a bit to read here, but bear with me as I begin. When it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. When he had boarded a ship of Andromedium, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we put out at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. When we had put out to sea from there, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. After sailing through the open sea off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we reached Myrna and Lycia. There the centurion found the Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. Sailing slowly for many days, with difficulty we arrived off Cnidus. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salmone. With still more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous. Since the Day of Atonement was already over, Paul gave his advice and told them, "Men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing the southwest and northwest, and to winter there. When a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind, called a northeaster, rushed down from the island. Since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. After hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship, fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis. They lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. For many days, neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was faded that we would be saved. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For last night an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island.' When the 14th night came, we were drifting into the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight the sailors thought they would be approaching land. They took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. When they had sailed a little bit farther, they sounded again. They found it to be 90 feet deep. Then, fearing we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair on your head." After he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after he broke it, he began to eat. They all were encouraged and took food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, so that no one could swim away and escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan, because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks and some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. Once safely ashore, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The local people showed us extraordinary kindness. They lit a fire and took us all in, since it was raining and cold. As Paul gathered a bundle of brushwood and put it on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself to his hand. When the local people saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man no doubt is a murderer. Even though he had escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But he shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no harm. They expected that he would begin to swell up or suddenly drop dead. After they waited a long time and saw nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Now in the area around the place was an estate belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Publius's father was in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went to him and prayed, and laying his hands on him, he healed him. After this, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. So they heaped many honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed. After 3 months, we set sail in an Alexandrian ship that had wintered at the island, with the twin gods as its figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there 3 days. From there, after making a circuit along the coast, we reached Rhegium. After one day, a south wind sprang up, and the second day we came to Puteoli. There we found brothers and sisters, and were invited to stay a week with them. And so we came to Rome. Now the brothers and sisters from there had heard the news about us and had come to meet us as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier who guarded him. All right, we made it through. No one fell asleep. You know what? Just a side note. All of those names and things that are in Greek, I can't tell you. I go through, I listen to how they're pronounced, I practice them, but when I read them, it's just, I'm like, I don't know how that word is said. So if you struggle with it, it's okay. Everyone does. So as we read this, it's an account of this. I mean, it's almost like you're watching a movie or you're reading one of the epics of Greek mythology, right? These great voyages of these heroes here. This is a true story of God fulfilling his call in Paul's life, getting him from Jerusalem to Rome. And it didn't happen. You know, we wish, it was just smooth sailing. He got on a boat, And it could just have been a couple verses, right? He got on a boat, and a little bit later they arrived in Rome. But that's not how it happened. And we see this, all of these trials and things come into Paul's life, and with his companions there, you'll notice that this whole account is written as we and us. And that's Luke. Remember, Luke is the one who's writing this. He is with Paul during this journey. And so we get a first-hand account of this journey. And one thing to understand before we begin is that sailing or being on the sea during this time is very different from how it is today. All right, we think, oh, I've been on the ocean. If you said, I've been on a big boat that went a long way, most of us, if we have done that, it's probably on what? A cruise ship, right? This was not a cruise ship. They didn't have that. They had these boats, and any time that you went out into the open ocean, it was very, very dangerous. So I have a map up here that you can look at that shows kind of how this journey went. I know that it's small, but I tried to pick the most simplistic one with the biggest letters. But here you have where they began, right over here in Jerusalem. They sailed from Caesarea and went to Sidon all the way over here. And this is the area where they tried to take refuge for the winter. And it's ironic that the place that they wanted to was called Fair Haven, and it wasn't such a fair haven. And so after they sailed, they tried to make it. They shipwrecked on Malta and were there for about 3 months and then headed all the way to Rome. So that's just to give you an idea. But when they were in the open ocean, especially during this time of year, it was very, very dangerous. And so this is what we're seeing happen as they begin this journey. But as we think about this, I want us to look at this story, this account of Paul's journey, and remember this. This is going to be our main focus this morning. Because we live in a fallen world marked by the scars of sin and rebellion against God, we will face storms in this life. But we can take courage in the middle of those storms when we focus on God's blessing, trust in His promises, and rest in His providence. It's the first one we're going to focus on, and I actually changed this because I was reading that I have promises and providence, and then I started with blessing, and I thought, I can't miss this opportunity. Instead of blessing, we're going to put provision, and then I have 3 P's, all right? And everyone can remember that, okay? So the first one is focus on God's provision. You see, when we face storms in life, we read about this actual storm that Paul was in, but it's really a metaphor for all that he has faced to get to where God wanted him to be. And so for us in our lives, it may not be that we're on a boat facing a storm and shipwreck and a snake coming out and biting our hand, but we're going to face trials and difficulties in this life. And when we do that, storms reveal what we truly believe and what we ultimately value. And we see that in this story. Verses 18 through 20 in chapter 27 talk about how when things got really bad on the ship, what did these sailors do? These experienced men, they started throwing stuff over. And I'm sure that the stuff that they threw over was not just useless stuff. All right, they weren't getting out there like special blankets and pillows and like, oh, I guess we don't need this. No, they said they threw over the tackle, the things that they needed for the ship to function well, but they thought our lives are more important than this stuff, so they start to throw it over, and it shows what's truly important in our lives. They were willing to do a lot just to save their own lives. You see, storms, when they come into our lives, either confirm our faith or they shake our faith. And we look at our lives and we can tell that that's true, isn't it? When we face difficulty and uncertainty, either those circumstances shake our faith or they confirm our faith, what we believe. They either drive us to God or they drive us from Him. And we see that that's true in this. We see Paul, not a perfect man, but we see him constantly when he faces trials and difficulties and stonings and persecutions and in jail and shipwreck and snake bite. Consistently, he turns to God. He grows in his trust of who God is. We must do the same in our own lives. Storms also often distract us from thanking God for what He is doing in our lives, don't they? When we face difficulty in life, when we face storms, whatever that might be in our lives, we are really good at focusing on the negative. We get so wrapped up in what isn't going our way that we miss all the things that we can be thankful for. We're so quick, again, to focus on the negative aspects that we see in our lives around us. I heard this word one time, and I think that it does well at explaining what I'm talking about. It's the word thankful, right? Have you heard that before? Thankful. Not thankful, but thankful. But it gives the idea of this is something we have to force ourselves to do. If we're going to be thankful for things in our lives, it needs to be a conscious choice. We need to always be thinking about what God is doing and has done in our lives and choose to focus on those things instead of all the negative that we see around us. You know, it was easy for Paul just to focus on how things weren't going his way. All right, he was arrested. Remember that one sentence at the end of our last passage that Agrippa said, well, if he wouldn't have appealed to Caesar, he probably could have been free, right? He could have been frustrated with that. He could have been frustrated that he's on this ship and there's shipwreck. He could have been frustrated they were stuck on this island. He was bitten by a snake. There's all these things in Paul's story that he could have said, well, how does God care about me? Look at all these bad things that are happening to me. But now we see this whole story and what God is doing, and I believe Paul saw it too, at least what God revealed to him, and he trusted God. And he was thankful, and he saw God, how he was working. He wasn't distracted by all of the negative things. Do you know people that are like this, who are thankful? You ever around someone like that, who just always sees the good in what's happening? You like to be around those people sometimes. Sometimes it might get kind of annoying. Like, why are you always happy, right? But we all should seek to be people like that, not because we're just ignoring the bad things that have happened in our lives, because there are bad things that happen, because we live in a sinful and broken world. It's not that we're ignoring those and acting like they're not there, but it's choosing rather to focus on all of the blessings and provision that God has given to me. As we're singing these songs, as I look around this morning, I have so many things to be thankful for. We all do. Even in the midst of difficulty, there are so many things to be thankful for. Are you purposefully thinking of those things and praising God for them? Or are you so stuck on what isn't going your way? In our story, they're shipwrecked here in the story that we just read. But God spared their lives, right? He saved them. A lot of these men were focused on the fact that the ship is gone. We got to throw all these things over. What's next? But they missed it. God spared their lives. And then also, God gave them an opportunity to continue to share the gospel even on their journey. Those people in Malta that experienced the healing through Paul's ministry, and we always know that Paul used that as a platform for the gospel. So sharing God's truth with these people in Malta that never would have heard if they had smooth sailing. God had a plan. There was much to be thankful for. Also, storms should not affect us like they affect those who don't have a relationship with God. Everyone in life faces storms. But as followers of God, as those who have placed your faith and trust in God, we should view storms much differently. The storms should affect us much differently than they affect those around us. First of all, we shouldn't be surprised by them, right? So often we act like, oh, I can't believe this is happening in my life. Why are bad things happening to me? I don't deserve this. But if we look at Scripture, and we've talked about this a lot through the book of Acts, trials are something that we can expect in life, especially when we choose to follow after Jesus. Jesus himself told his disciples this: if you choose to follow after me, if you take up your cross and follow after me, then there are going to be difficulties. The world hates me and persecuted me. Don't be surprised when they do the same thing to you. So, first of all, trials and storms and suffering should not surprise us. But also, we cannot be weak Christians. We cannot be weak Christians. And I could spend a whole message on this. I won't. But I want this to sink in. There are many people who call themselves Christians today, who trust in Jesus and follow after him, that are weak Christians. I pray that that is not true about you. I pray that it is not true about our church. What do I mean by a weak Christian? There's a word, and Heather will laugh because we talked about this a while, but how many of you have ever heard the word milquetoast? Anyone? Raise your hand. Milquetoast, a few people. All right, so I don't know where I first heard this, but it's always just stuck with me because it's a funny word and I like it, and I think it's a very, very accurate. But it's kind of based off of a dish, like a breakfast dish. That's what it sounds like. It's a piece of toast with milk on it. So you can imagine it's soggy. But then there was, what made it popular was a comic that was written a long time ago where there was a character in it that was called Milquetoast, spelled a little bit different. And this character was someone who kind of embodied a piece of soggy bread, right? Don't be soggy bread Christians, okay? That's my encouragement to you today. Don't be soggy bread Christians. But this word milquetoast is defined by a very timid, unassertive, spineless person, especially one who is easily dominated or intimidated. All right, one thing that we see as we study the life of Paul, none of those things describe him, do they? As we just finished focusing on missions through the month of November, we hopefully you were reading those biographies that were tucked inside your bulletin. As we talked about these great missionaries throughout history that God empowered and sent all over the world, one thing that is common among all of them is they were not milquetoast. They were bold for the gospel. They weren't pushed around by everything that happened. They weren't easily offended. They weren't easily pushed away from following God's calling in their lives. In the American church today, it's sad to say, but I believe we have a lot of milquetoast Christians. God has not called us to be that way. And you ask, well, why? It doesn't mean that we just say, well, I'm just going to be manly. That's not what I'm talking about. Heather and I joke, we sometimes, I know this probably sounds bad. I probably should explain this before, but we laugh. We sometimes say, buck up, right? To the kids or to each other in a very loving and kind, joking way. If someone's complaining or like, woe is me, these things, buck up, right? How as Christians, why as Christians should we not be milquetoast? Should we learn to buck up? Should we have a spine and be like Paul and not be so easily pushed away from what God has called us to do or offended by things? How do we do that? Well, Ephesians 3:16. This is Paul writing a letter, and it's expressing a prayer that he has for the church in Ephesus. He says, I pray that he may grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power in your inner being through his Spirit. We should be strong. We have a spine as Christians because we have the Holy Spirit living in us. We don't have to be weak. We are strengthened because of him. Romans 8:31. Which I only read for us this morning. It says, if God is for us, right, who is against us? Who can be against us if God is for us? We can go out with boldness, not because we just mustered it up, but because we know who's behind us. Who God, not just behind us, but going before us, preparing the way, lifting us up, strengthening us. In verse 37, just a few verses later in Romans 8, it says, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. This is who we are as Christians. We must be strong. We cannot be weak Christians. So first of all, we must focus on God's provision, but secondly, we must trust in God's promises. Trust in God's promises. Here in our story, as Paul is there, he's on the ship. He's not worried, is he? I'm sure there were times where he looked around and he thought, this is pretty bad. But he is the one that's able to say, hey, take courage. Why? Because God has promised him. He knows God's promises. God promised him that he would be in Rome, that he would testify before Caesar. So he's saying, if God tells me I'm going to get there, then I don't need to worry. Instead of worrying in the midst of this storm, I'm going to trust that what God told me is true is true. Paul was very aware of what God had promised to him, and that's our first thing is we have to, in order to trust God's promises, you need to know them. Read God's word. Know his promises. It framed the way that Paul viewed everything. It also prevented him from panicking like the rest of those sailors and soldiers on the boat and allowed him to comfort and care for them. Take courage. When God speaks, listen. Read his word. Know his promises. But it's not just about knowing promises. It's not just enough to have them in our heads. We have to really believe that they're true. Believe God's promises. You know, sometimes we're a lot like Julius, the centurion that was on the ship when he heard Paul's warning. As they're about to set sail, remember Paul says, don't do this. It's dangerous out there. If you go, there's going to be severe loss. And he chooses to listen to the captain and the owner of the boat instead of Paul, which we can't fault him too much for that. If the captain said, no, I can do this. But what was it? That fit his agenda. Julius knew that he needed to get these prisoners to Rome, and he wasn't going to delay. And so he took the advice of whatever fit what he wanted. We got to make sure that we don't live our lives that way. But it's so easy to do, isn't it? We want to listen to the advice that fits our agenda. We are quick to grab a hold of God's word when it fits the way that we are living, but how quickly we close our ears when the truth convicts our hearts. We have to not only know God's promises in his word, but we have to believe it. Believe that it's true. And then, once we believe it, we need to act on it. Act on God's promises. You see, once Julius, the centurion, realized that Paul had some connection to greater power than himself, his tune changed a little bit. He said, this guy Paul knows what he's talking about. And when Julius finally believed that, it moved him to action. Remember in the story, the guys who said, we're going to lower some anchors over on the bow, don't mind us, and they try to lower the lifeboat and escape. Because during this time, they believed that, remember the story of Jonah, where Jonah was running from God, and so there was punishment on Jonah that was affecting the whole boat, and they thought if they can get away from Jonah or get Jonah away from them, then everything will be fine. And so these guys are trying to get away from Paul because they think maybe, or these prisoners, because they're the ones bringing this retribution on them. And so they try to escape, but Julius cuts the line. Because Paul said, if they go, then you're not going to survive. And so he believes Paul. He acts on it. And when they finally shipwreck, the soldiers are going to kill all of the prisoners. But he remembers what Paul said, and he acts on it. He says, don't do that. He orders them not to kill any of the prisoners. His actions prove that he believed what Paul said. You see, our lives should be a reflection of what we believe. In chapter 28, verse 5, remember when the snake bit Paul? And he's sitting there, he's kind of holding his hand up. Here's this snake hanging off of it. And what does he do? He shakes it off into the fire. No harm done. And he goes about his business. Can you imagine seeing that? But why didn't he say, oh no, I need it quick, get me to the closest hospital, I can't do it. Why was he not worried? Because he believed God's promises. And he was acting on that. You know, one of the things I love doing with my kids is, you ever do trust falls? Right? Maybe you've been the recipient of a bad experience with a trust fall. But I try to do it with my kids. I have them climb up on the ladder to the bunk bed, and I say, all right, just don't look at me, just fall back and trust me. You know how hard that is for a little kid to do? To just trust, to just like let go and fall back. They're always sticking a leg back or doing something because they don't quite trust their dad. I don't know why, right? I've never let them down before. I've never let them hit the ground, that's for sure. But it takes a long time. And you know what? I start to get a little bit frustrated when they keep not trusting me. I'm like, you have to trust me. I'm your dad. I'm telling you to trust me. Just fall back. And I get frustrated. I can only imagine how God feels sometimes when he gives us promises in his word, and then we sit there and we don't trust him. And we keep looking back and like, well, God, are you sure? Well, maybe I'm just going to be careful and put my leg back a little bit, take things into my own hands. I can only imagine how God gets frustrated with us in a righteous way as only He can do. But just trust me. I'm here for you. I will be true to my promises. Yet so often we don't trust Him. We don't act on it. Belief should drive us to action. The way that we live, the way that we talk, the choices that we make should announce to everyone around us that we believe what God says. Finally, we rest in God's providence. Providence has been a theme throughout our study in the book of Acts. Providence is basically just saying that God is in control. It doesn't take long for us to realize we're not in control of our lives, right? We would like to be, but we're not. If we're followers of God, we can rest knowing that He is in control of the storm. He is in control of our lives. One thing that's important to understand is that God does not work according to the ways of man. And as we look at this story, to help us frame kind of how the soldiers and the other sailors were reacting to this, we have to understand this theology of divine retribution. So during this time, in a lot of Greek and Roman theology, what they viewed about the gods or how things worked in the world was this idea of divine retribution. And simply put, it's this: misfortunes are punishments for wrong actions, right? So if you did something bad's going to happen in your life. Or if something bad happens to you in your life, that means that you deserve it, because that's just how the gods work. And we know that God does not work that way. Sometimes we like to think that way. A lot of you know, and I mentioned this before, I enjoy playing pickleball, right? How many of you like pickleball, right? Okay, good. But as you play pickleball, sometimes as you're going, the ball can land really close to the line. And it could be out, it could be in, no one really knows, but the person on whoever side it's on is supposed to call it in or out. And sometimes there's disagreement on that, right? Where someone said, I think that was in. No, I think that was out. And so what we do a lot of times is just say, well, okay, let's keep playing, and whoever gets the next point, that's going to show who was right, right? Like if you said it was in and it really wasn't, then you're going to make a mistake and hit it out. And so then we play in the next point and say, see, I was right. Or see, you were wrong. But it's the same idea of divine retribution. You do something wrong, something bad's going to happen to you. You do something right, something good will happen. Thankfully, God does not work that way in our lives. Many believe that if Paul was truly innocent, that these bad things wouldn't have happened to him. When the storm came, they believed this is confirmation that Paul is guilty. This is why some of the men tried to get off the ship. They didn't want to be dragged down with these guilty people. And then they're saved, and they think, well, maybe he's not guilty. And then the snake comes out and bites him, right? Okay, I guess he is guilty. And it's this back and forth of not understanding why God is doing all of these things, because they're putting him into this box that they believe in this divine retribution. But God does not work that way. We can be thankful He doesn't. There's not the idea of karma. That's not how God works. But there is one God who ultimately judges all men on the basis not of their good deeds and bad deeds, but on the basis of their belief in or their rejection of Jesus. That is the God that we serve. And God ultimately delivered Paul, confirming his innocence. But more than that, the reason that God spared Paul's life and protected him was not just to confirm that he was innocent. It was validating his message. Because here's the big point. It's not all about Paul. It's not just that Paul gets safely where he wants to go. It's not just that Paul is justified in the eyes of all these people. He was wrongly condemned, so God needs to make it right. No, God made it right so that he can continue to get to where he needs to go before Caesar, to continue to share truth. It's not about Paul. And guess what? It's not about me. It's not about you. We are so easily drawn into that way of thinking of this is all about me. God's going to bless me to make my life better and give me good things because I'm following after him. It's not all about us. we have the privilege and the opportunity of serving the Almighty Creator. And He is working for much bigger purposes than just us and our safety and our happiness, right? And if we understand that, then we truly can have hope and happiness and joy knowing that we are a part of something much bigger, that the gospel would go to the ends of the earth. We must learn to rest in God's plan even when we do not know the outcome. That's hard to do, isn't it? It's hard to rest when we don't know the outcome. Here Paul is finally heading to Rome, right? But not the way he anticipated it. I'm sure when God first told him, you're going to go to Rome, he thought, okay, I'm going to take another missionary journey and get on a boat and go there. He didn't think he was going to be a prisoner and have a shipwreck and get bitten by a snake and all of these things. But here, he continues to have faith in God. Not the way that he thought, but look at this. Here, he's getting to Rome, and he travels at the expense of the Roman Empire. That's pretty nice, isn't it? He's with his friends. He's able to bring Luke and others along with him. And he's traveling not as some of these prisoners who are chained. He's traveling as an uncondemned man, right? He has not yet been condemned of these crimes. No one has said he's guilty. And on top of that, he has the favor of the centurion guard. So here he's going to Rome. God set everything up because he was faithful and following after him. You know what? We may not know the outcome of the storms that we're in, but we do know this. We have been delivered. If you place your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, you have been delivered. Through Jesus, we always have a reason to rejoice. Through Jesus, we always have a hope to cling to in the midst of storms. You see, God is working for our good and for His glory, always. And we can rest in that. So we ask the question, so what? Why is this important, right? What do we take away from this? First of all, are you focused on God's hand of provision and blessing in your life? Or are you distracted by all the cares and worries and storms of this world? What are you focusing on? Are you being thankful? Are you purposefully focusing on the good that God is doing in and through you? Or do you just choose to push those things aside and focus on how things aren't going my way? Secondly, are you trusting in God's promises? Like Paul, does what you know to be true about God drive how you think and how you act? And then finally, are you resting in God's providence, knowing that you are secure in Him? If you're trusting in Jesus, He's in control. We cannot control our own lives. What a joy it is to know that we are resting in the Almighty Creator and Sustainer of all things. That is where we find our stability in the midst of the storm. Let's pray.